It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the Coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, mate, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day and welcome once again to the Two Jacks. It's episode number 96, Jack. That would be the first time you saw a breast in the wild, wouldn't it?
I can vaguely recall it. Of course, it was.
Look, that's for our older listeners. Many of our younger ones won't know what number 96 is or was. It was a Network 10 production, wasn't it? Based
I think
around
so. It was
comings and goings at number 96, wherever it was.
The block of flats that they used at the start of the show still exists in Elizabeth Bay.
Oh, does it? Yeah. Where is it? What suburb?
It's in Elizabeth Bay.
It's still in. Well, not still in, but it's Elizabeth Bay.
I think it's on Elizabeth Bay
by now.
I think it's on Elizabeth Bay Road, actually, but it's it's kind of like a 2 flats wide, 6 flats high, and it had a shop down the bottom.
Yeah. Shop at the bottom, or cafe, and I think they had a florist or something. Don Finlayson played the gay actor, first gay kiss on TV, first set of breasts on TV, although that might have been The Box, which was a similar production based around a television network. But we better get on, Jack. We better not muse about these things. We might lapse into some sort of adolescent fantasy. We have a lot to get through this episode, starting with the cost of living in Australia, a very serious problem. A very serious problem for governments, but a very serious problem, far more serious problem for consumers, Jack, families and what have you. And it looks like we won't get within the RBA's band, safe band of cost of living, or CPI, for some time.
No, it would seem not. And
that would reduce the opportunity of obviously an interest rate decline in the early new year before the next election.
No, at the moment it doesn't look like the government's going to get what it really wants, which is a couple of interest rate reductions before the election. That seems unlikely.
Yeah, and to be honest, I mean, households are still struggling. I think the cost of energy has gone down. I think the cost of petrol has gone down. Petrols and oils has gone down. Where there are significant pressures are in the rental markets, Jack. And we probably have
and groceries, I believe.
And groceries too. Although I think a lot of them have come off, with the exception, I think, of meats and fresh foods. But there are other areas that there are significant constraints. So basically, households are still suffering. And what we've seen from our year of elections in 2024 is that incumbents get bashed over inflation, don't they? Over cost of living pressures.
They do. It's not impossible, but it's difficult to hold on to government when you're facing these sort of economic problems.
Yeah,
but particularly inflation, because inflation affects a large proportion of the population, and it's the less well off end that it affects most.
Indeed, when you're talking about basics of spending, like food, the opposition Treasury spokesman Angus Taylor said Australians would be still living with the damage of the inflation crisis well into the late 2020s. Australians are worse off than they were almost 3 years ago, and there is no quick recovery in sight. Australian households will continue to feel the pain of 12 rate rises, unless you're an investor and you're quite happy, under Labor for many more years to come. Costs are up, incomes are down, and families are really struggling. We've got net wages growth running around about 1%, Jack.
I think so. Yeah.
I think that's about right, and that is an average annual rise in living standards of around 1%. A return to pre-election living standards may not occur until closer to the end of the decade. We talked last week, we quoted from Greg Jericho's column in The Guardian, where he maintained there were significant problems with economic growth in the States, but he also maintained that Australians were pretty much where they were in 2015. So Angus Taylor perhaps doesn't want to be reminded about his time in government, but it's been, we're basically gone back about a decade.
Yep.
Well, we must have an election. It's going to have to be before September. I think the 24th is the cut-off point, but it's likely to be earlier. And the Albanese government, is going to have to head off that particular problem because it is a government killer, as we've seen all around the world this year, regardless of whether you're left or right.
It's not impossible to win with these conditions, but it's a hard weight to carry. So you've got to have everything else going right to win in those circumstances, and that's the government's problem. They don't have enough else going that's going well.
Alrighty, now before the Parliament in the last sitting week in Canberra, Jack, there are a number of bills that are not going that the government hopes will get through. And the teenage access to social media is one that will get through because it has coalition support. There are amendments, and there are proposed amendments. Zoe Daniel, the Teal Independent, has proposed some. Jack, what do you think of them? You want to run through them for us?
Oh, yeah. What's she talking about? Laws around transparency of risk mitigation.
What's that,
penalties?
Mate? Does it mean anything?
No idea. Penalties of up to 10% of global revenue for social media companies. That's not going to happen. They'd just shut down in Australia if it came to that. Civil penalties for the onshore executives.
The onshore, Elon Musk. He's not an onshore executives, though, is he? But there would
he's not. No,
there would be onshore executives in Australia for X. Elon Musk, by the way, Jack, has pretty much poo-pooed these laws.
He has, but you would expect that.
Yes, you would expect that. User control over the algorithm. What? Oh, yes. So you can define what you want to see and what you don't want to see, etc.
Yeah.
Which kind of happens anyway. But anyway, and finally, default privacy settings upon account setup. Well, those are Zoe Daniels things. I don't think they're going to get up. We have discussed this bill for a little while, but let's throw in a third party. Our dear farming listener, Lawrence, has written a long letter, but where he relates it to this particular legislation. He writes, on the under-16 social media ban legislation, I agree it's dumb and can't be enforced. However, I think UNHK Jack are underestimating its popularity. Most parents are concerned about the influence of social media on their children's young minds. Too many are unwilling to be the bad guy themselves and limit their own children's access. I think that's a really good point that needs to be sort of worked through. It's like parents saying, we'll let the government make the hard decisions so we don't have to. Lawrence goes on. So they will welcome the government intervention as a win. Now, there was some polling published in the Daily Telegraph yesterday saying that 77% of people supported this. I'm not entirely sure that that's the way it will stand once the legislation gets through. It does have the support of the opposition, so it's going to come with us, and there will be a lot of kids who will be able to get around it. But is it, Jack? Is it that a couple of old blokes haven't really understood how parents feel about all this stuff?
Well, I'm not surprised that it's popular with a lot of parents for the reasons you just said, and for, as Lawrence said, that it's easier to blame the government than to have a chat to your kids and say they can't do this or that.
Let the government be the bad guy.
Yeah,
I,
yeah.
I love all that. Well, we'd like you to have a bit of Facebook, a bit of Instagram.
Yeah.
YouTube's allowed. I mean, this is some of the crazy stuff, Jack. I was looking at it. A kid under 16 won't be able to have a Facebook account, but they will have to open a Facebook account in order to get Facebook Messenger, which is approved, and then close their Facebook account. It sounds fantastic so far, doesn't it? YouTube's not in it, and YouTube really, when you think about some of the rubbish that's on there, there's some quality material too. It's a huge library, but saying no to Instagram while saying yes to YouTube seems a bit odd to me. Of course, there's a lot of kids' TV and entertainment on there on the YouTube channel. But yeah, it looks like one of those things where the government will pump its fists, the opposition will pat itself on the back for all their work, and then in about 6 months' time, everyone going, well, why do we do this?
It is a classic case of we need to do something. This is something, so let's do it. But Lawrence makes a very good point. Yeah, I'm sure it is popular with the parents.
Yep. Yeah. Well, the polling. I mean, I wouldn't think it was 77, but the polling says yes. Now, moving on.
I was a little surprised that the opposition supported it when I first read that they were going to, because I thought, gee, this might be a winner for them to stand against government regulation. But they clearly agree with Lawrence. They think it's popular as well.
Now, Jack, completely unscripted, but you work well ad hoc. We had a conviction made yesterday of Christian White, a serving New South Wales police officer who infamously tased a 95-year-old resident, Claire Nolan, and she fell and hit her head. She was pushing around a walker and held a knife in her hand. Senior Constable Christian White tased her. She fell to the ground and suffered a very serious head injury from which she did not recover and died a couple of days later in hospital. Christian White has now been found guilty by a jury. There is some sentencing discussion to be had today. Christian White was allowed to leave the courtroom yesterday, but it's likely that, depending on submissions to the court, that a custodial sentence will be sought by the prosecutor, and in that event, it may well be that Christian White heads off to jail today. What sort of sentence would come? You would know the case, Jack, pretty well, yeah?
Yeah, I've followed the case, sort of not closely, but I have. He was found guilty of manslaughter.
Yes. Well, thank you for clarifying that. Yes, he's found guilty of manslaughter. The maximum penalty for that in New South Wales is 25 years. If you put your judge's horse hair wig on and from what you understand of the circumstances, what sort of sentence should be handed down for Christian White?
The judge has already made the comment that he is concerned about the jailing of a policeman, right? Of the safety aspects of that. That he has said that he would want to know where and under what circumstances the prisoner would be held.
HM Park Lee.
HM Park Lee, is it?
Yeah, that's where I think that a lot of them end up. Yeah, not that there are many here, but there will be a couple serving sentences. Of course, Rogerson was in Long Bay, but he was not a serving police officer when he was sentenced.
No. So I think that's a reasonable thing for the judge to look at. In
mitigating circumstance,
yeah. And manslaughter. I mean, I know it's got a sentence up to 25 years, but it's one of those crimes that has there's a long gradation from the most serious manslaughters to the least serious manslaughters, if you like. They all involve a death, but there's a big difference between the actions of the convicted, in some case, from the lower end to the higher end. Some manslaughters are, well, gee, you were a bit fortunate you didn't get done for murder, this was
What
sort
you
of
did led to the death of, yes.
Yeah. This is sort of, borderline accidental, negligent, and it led to a death. So there's a big difference in that. I suspect that you're probably always going to get a custodial sentence for manslaughter, but it might not be very long, and the judge may seek reassurances that he will be held somewhere where he will not be subject to violence from the general prison community.
It's in order to avoid that, Christian White, one imagines, at least for a significant period of his sentence, would be in protective custody, which means that he is very solitary. He is in a cell on his own. He exercises alone. So it's a pretty tough sentence. My guess, for what it's worth, Jack, is 4 on the roof and maybe around 2.5 minimum. That sort of sentence.
I think that's probably right, but I wouldn't fall off my chair if there was very little custodial aspect to it and there was something
Interesting.
else.
It has caused a great deal of outrage in the community, and I did see Karen Webb, the Chief Commissioner or the Commissioner of New South Wales Police, saying yesterday that it was regrettable, and the initial response and communications from the Commissioner and her office and all the way down was pretty unsatisfactory early on. They did look after their own a fair bit in those first few days, and then he was charged with his actions occasioning grievous bodily harm, and that was after the victim passed away. That was moved up to manslaughter.
I think a fair bit of the outrage stemmed from the way the police handled it after the incident rather than the incident itself.
Oh buggerette is what Mr. White, Senior Constable White, I believe he'll be let go from the police today. He said, I'm going to tase you, I'm going to tase you, I'm going to tase you 3 times. And he said, oh, bugger it. And then I think he'd already fired the taser by that stage. I also have to wonder about the people working in places like this, Jack. I mean, when you call the police and say someone's walking around with a knife, they have a number of sort of procedures to go through, a number of risk assessments to make. And I just wonder if perhaps the communications from the nursing home might have been a bit better.
Yeah, and perhaps the training of the police officer might have been a bit better as well.
He seemed unaware and only discovered it afterwards that there are, in the course of his training, he claims that he was never shown a bit of a caveat on the use of tasers, that they're not to be used on elderly people. And he only realised afterwards that was the case. So he had been trained the use of a taser, but claimed that he had not been advised that elderly people should not be tased.
Ultimately, I mean, he's been convicted, as I understand it, because the jury didn't think that he was under any threat, so then he shouldn't have used that sort of force against an elderly person. So that's just a question of fact, but perhaps his training was a bit deficient.
Yes, it would seem so. And by the way, there's been a civil settlement with the family of the deceased, and that is an undisclosed amount, but I would think it would be a fairly significant figure.
I'd be surprised if it's very large. It's hard to get large settlements for people who die when they're already elderly.
Yeah, but I, given the circumstances, Jack, I would think it would be a fairly significant. It'd be certainly 7 figures, I would imagine. But it's undisclosed, so we can only speculate. Moving on, Jack, with our crime theme, Greg Lynn, the man found guilty of murdering camper Carol Clay in central Victoria, the wilds of central Victoria, has filed an appeal, Jack. I've read a fair bit about this case since his conviction. What chance do you think he's got of having his appeal heard by the full bench?
Yeah, pretty good.
Yeah?
Yep.
They used a hell of a lot of surveillance of the home that was pretty damning as far as I could read. But yeah, go on. Why do you think so?
Well, I thought the argument about the first ground of appeal that the prosecutor launched a sustained attack on the credibility of Lynn's account without putting those claims to him when he was on the stand, and that's a real no-no.
Well, the closing address was the subject of some criticism as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would have thought, just having a quick read of it, I'd have thought this is, some of these appeals are quite hopeless. I wouldn't have put this one in that category.
Okay, well, we'll keep an eye on that. Of course, we don't even know a date, and there's been no. Well, the Court of Appeal will decide whether it goes ahead and when it goes ahead.
Yeah, it will. The other thing they've asked for is that if the appeal is successful, they want a stay of proceedings because they don't think it would be possible to give him a fair trial, and that I think has some merit as well. I think we've gotten ourselves into a situation now where it's very, very difficult with modern media coverage for someone to get a fair trial once they've been convicted and if they go back to a second trial.
Jack, there's another old criminal case that's been mentioned very recently. It got a run on 60 Minutes with Nick McKenzie, and it's been run pretty hard with the 9 newspapers. Caused a great deal of angst among certain sections of the community, and this is in regards to the murder of a 20-year-old woman in 1988 by the name of Janine Balding, who was abducted at knife point, I'm going to say, from a Southern Railway station before being repeatedly gang raped and brutally murdered by a pack of youths. The attempt at bringing out an appeal relates to one of those convicted and sentenced never to be released, Stephen Shorty Jamieson. Jamieson made a confession to police, but he is claiming now that confession was made under duress, that he didn't commit the offence, and he is seeking leave to appeal as we speak, Jack.
Yeah. I can vaguely recall the case, but I'm not all over the details of it.
I've written about this case. It was a horrendous crime, and this is why it's caused a great deal of angst among the community. It was an absolutely appalling crime, right up there with the murder of Anita Cobby by those scumbags, the Murphy brothers, and what's his name, John? I can't think of it now, but an absolutely horrendous piece of work. John Travis, I think his name was.
Don't get the name wrong, for God's sake.
But we've had a response from the family published in the Australian yesterday, and that's the family of Janine Balding. David Balding has said he knew the day would come when one of the predators who abducted and attacked his older sister Janine and abused a string of other women would be released from jail, but it didn't stop the creeping anger and frustration he was feeling on Tuesday. He said, I'm fully aware that they can't contain him forever, so I was anticipating this, but it's not easy. Mr. Balding lives in Wagga Wagga. What they put Janine through, they should never, ever be out of jail as far as I'm concerned. I don't think the community would disagree too much. However, Jack, we do know that New South Wales policing in and around that period, there was a habit there that is now not accepted, where unsworn statements were presented to the courts, what we call verbals. Did I say unsworn? I meant to say unsigned.
Yep.
Statements that were effectively confessions were presented to the courts in what's the practice of verballing, Jack. And I think that is what those are arguing around Stephen Shorty Jamieson. He was essentially a street kid. He has an IQ of around about 50 or 60, and as it stands, he's looking at spending pretty much the rest of his life in jail. But he maintains that he did not make a confession in the company police.
This is going to be a difficult job for the courts, isn't it?
Yeah, we haven't got to that stage. I mean, I gather applications may well be filed, but we haven't got to that stage where there's been a request to appeal. And that's another one we'll keep an eye on. One of those horrendous crimes that stayed in our memories for a very, very long time.
I think they've asked the Supreme Court to reopen it, and the Supreme Court hasn't come to a conclusion yet.
Yeah, sorry, that's right. Yeah, that's true too. So we'll keep an eye on that. We'll report on anything that comes of it. I spoke to an old Daily Telegraph journalist who had covered that story yesterday, and she was furious that this matter has been reopened. I suppose for all the family and friends of the victim that have been re-traumatised by it. But if Shorty Jamieson does believes he's been the subject of a miscarriage of justice, and he's maintained long ago, and to be fair, has maintained this for a very long time, that he was not involved in the murder. All right, moving on. Western Australian Liberals, Jack. Are they a chance to win the state election in WA in March? I mean, firstly, you got to ask when you get to the WA Liberals. You got to ask, do they exist? And the answer is yes, barely. I think they've only got the two members in the lower house, Jack.
Yeah, the Liberal leader is not the opposition leader in Western Australia. The opposition leader is the National Party leader, because they think they have the 4 seats and Liberals have 2. They need a 23% swing to win. Is where it is. But I was taken by this because what's his name? Basil Zempilas.
Basil Zempilas gets them apparently a 7% swing when compared with Libby Mettam, the current leader.
Yeah, he's got a pretty full life already, Basil Zempilas. I think he's still on the television. He's mayor of Perth, etc., etc.
Anything to keep him off the commentary, Jack. He's one of the worst football commentators I've ever come across.
Yeah,
just
Brian Taylor.
Just awful at it.
Brian Taylor, bad?
Oh, look. I'm not a huge fan of BT, but I could listen to BT for a few hours and not be as annoyed as I get with listening to Zempilas for 2 minutes.
Yeah, no, well, I was just, it intrigued me that it seems that he was mounting this campaign from outside Parliament to become the leader of the campaign with a guaranteed spot.
He's the current mayor of Perth, of course.
Yeah. And I wondered why you'd do that if you didn't think there was at least some prospect of becoming premier.
Yeah, we'll keep an eye on it. That would mean he would have to. He doesn't have to roll Mettam, does he? But
No.
From what the polling says, it would probably be in the party's best interest for him to be appointed leader.
It's all very curious because the government, the West Australian government, they have set date parliaments, they have fixed term parliaments, but they are worried that they will have to go to the polls before the federal government. So they're looking at they've asked for legal advice as to whether they can change the date of the fixed term.
They're fixed term. Why?
Because
I understand the political consequences, but you can't just say, well, there's going to be a federal election soon, so we won't have the state one for a while. I mean, I'm not buying that.
I don't know enough about the West Australian Constitution to know whether that can fly, but they haven't asked for the advice. So.
Okay, interesting. Well, you would expect they'll get a little bit of a belting because Labor, that is, because they won so substantially 4 years ago. Well, almost 4 years ago.
But 23% is a big swing.
Yeah, that's a big swing. That's going to take a while. All right. You've got a little piece in here about John Major. I thought we'd seen the last of him. Jack, what's he on about?
Yeah, no, I was talking to a chap I know the other day who's a member of one of the London clubs, and I think it's no longer in existence, the Commonwealth Club. Not as prestigious as the one that you were at a little while ago.
No, the Tories all go to the what's the name of it, Jack?
The Carlton.
Oh, is it the Carlton Club? Yeah,
okay. Or the Reform. I think they go
Reform might have a few Tories, but they tend to be sort of social liberals from the right and centrists, you know.
Anyway, he was he's a senior banker. When he was still living in London, John Major came along to give an address at lunch, and he was expecting. He said, "Oh, he's a bit reluctant to go," but one of his fellow members said, "Oh, come along. We haven't seen each other for lunch for a while." So he did. He was expecting John Major to be like he was on the television,
dry as a chip. Yeah,
dry as a chip. This is going to be a boring hour. I hope the wine's good, but he was. Pleasantly surprised to find that in that situation, he was engaging and warm and funny and all those kind of things, right? And we were talking about this, and I said, well, this seems to happen a bit with public figures, that what the public sees is quite contrary to what these people are like in real life.
Well, and that's more about the sort of modifying nature of politics and political messaging. And it does get to that point where it reduces the sort of natural personality of the politician. They really just want people who are almost like worker bees. And the same sort of thing occurred with Julia Gillard. I mean, people would openly shit can her and then get to meet her and go, "Oh, she's lovely."
Yes. Yeah,
and it's really not. I mean, there's obviously a difference between perception. We could sort of look at sports figures and celebrities and those sorts of things and say, well, you're a bit different to the way I perceive you on in the media and the social media, etc. But in politics, it's more a deliberate attempt to basically almost kill the personality, kill the individuality, because that's considered to be a bit risky.
In some cases in politics, I think it's bad advice that they get, that they should shy away from showing what they are.
Yeah. Julia Gillard was known as being cold and dispassionate and all those sorts of things, which anyone who knows her well, and her better than I do, would say is absolute rubbish.
Yeah, I'd known her for since law school, so since she was in law school, so it wasn't true of her, but. But it's an interesting thing. I think we need to. It's good to remember that even someone who's as dry as John Major may not be all that dry when you get them out of their usual habitat.
Well, you get Major on cricket. He's 81 years of age, by the way, but you get him on cricket. He loves cricket, doesn't he? He's an absolute cricket nuffy.
Yeah.
Look, United States, Jack, we've got to keep looking there. They're still counting votes in California.
Yeah, and they're getting a lot of rubbishing for this, and they should be. Part of it is a bad law that says that if you've done everyone in California is offered a postal vote, by the way. And if you're offered a postal vote and it's date stamped on or before the date of the election, they will count it if it arrives, I think, in 3 or 4 weeks after the election.
3 or 4 weeks? I thought you were going to say days.
No.
3 or 4 days, I think, is okay.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't say, it didn't. that does uh, include the possibility that people are voting after the election.
It does indeed. So that there's some bad regulations and laws, but it seems comically bad that the Indians can count voters in a country of a billion people, and the UK can count them all that night, and California's still counting them now.
And voting machines too, of course, in California. Well, they certainly were in 2020. And I believe they would have kept up with them there too. The Trump prosecutions, Jack Smith has filed to have what will we call it, no billed, the charges against Donald Trump to be no billed, because these are what was known as early days a 4-count indictment in DC, and that will obviously not proceed because the president can't be charged with an indictable offence. Not just Donald Trump, but a sitting president cannot be charged with an indictable offence, Jack.
He hasn't asked for that. He's asked for dismissal without prejudice, which means that
it could reopen it.
It could reopen it, yes.
What do you think about that, Jack?
It's not going to happen. Is the answer to that?
Yeah.
It looked to me like an attempt to salvage a bit of his reputation.
Well, our good friend Lawrence weighed in on this one too, Jack, and we're talking not so much about the indictments, which are all collapsing. I believe the Georgia stuff is dying a fairly protracted death as well.
And of course, Smith needed to get the Mar-a-Lago documents thing reinstated because that's being stayed at the moment. And he is not applying to do that. He's no longer applying to do that.
But our good friend Lawrence is talking about nominations, and we'll talk a bit about that. That is the Trump administration's nominations. There's a very odd one being announced today as we record this on the 28th of November. But Lawrence writes, the request by... Oh, sorry, that's the wrong line. Listen to the Two Jacks and conditional release program today. Perhaps Joel's rubbing off on me and I'm starting my own crazy theories. For me, the biggest difference between Trump 2016 and Trump 2024 is the Supreme Court ruling of immunity, prosecutorial immunity. You can add to that with the 2024 court ruling narrowing the scope of federal anti-bribery legislation and allowing officials to accept gratuities after an official act. Snyder v. United States, he cites. To paraphrase Hong Kong Jack, what's a property developer from Queens going to do? He's got carte blanche to run any grift he likes. It makes me wonder about the appointment of RFK Jr. As you pointed out, I presume that's me, out in both episodes, there is going to be a long line of CEOs outside the Oval Office door asking for Trump's help. The same guy who said to, so I know that's RFK's help he means there, the same guy who said to oil executives during the campaign, give me $1 billion and I'll abolish every restriction on your businesses. Sorry, that is Trump. On your businesses. What's it going to cost a company like Tyson Foods to get new proposals quashed? Getting more conspiratorial, Trump will probably wait until after the House and Senate pass the no tax on tips legislation so he gets to keep it all. Very cynical man today, Lawrence. But
I like the bit at the end about him equating this to tips.
Yes. Well, of course, when we're talking about some of the nominees, RFK Jr. we've discussed. One announced today, Jack. It's a ripper, and of course, it's not subject to Senate confirmation. Sebastian Gorka, Jack. He's been announced one of the security people's deputy assistant to the president and senior director for counterterrorism. Jack, he couldn't get a clearance last time he was with the administration in 2017. He couldn't get a security clearance.
And I doubt that he would have gotten through the Senate advise and consent process either, because he's quite unpopular with a lot of Republicans. There's been a bit of an attempt by some people around Trump to try and bully the Congress, the senators, into into passing. Into almost just endorsing all the nominations on the basis that, well, he's got the mandate because he won the presidency, and this is not right. I mean, the senators were elected as well, and they've got a job to do, and that process should take place as it normally does. That is,
well, Tulsi Gabbard is a fairly controversial appointment too. She's said to be in Putin's pocket and definitely made some outrageous remarks about the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian conflict. Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defence, both of those two will be subject to Senate confirmation, but Gawker won't be.
No.
Because of his position. And look, Gawker, I know he's probably not going to pick this up, but if he's not a Nazi, he probably does a very good impersonation of one. It's a very strange sort of appointment, and already people are saying that he'd be the first one out the door. And we already said that about RFK Jr. So we'll wait and see. There's a few people with tickets on them to be the first ones out the door of the Trump administration. And Gawker himself was given his marching orders in 2017 it would have been 2018 by Donald Trump's chief of staff, the former general. Help me out, Jack.
I've forgotten his name, but he went when Bannon went, basically.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so that is 2017, isn't it? And primarily he went because the agencies wouldn't give him an intelligence clearance, which means they've gone through the process and gone, oh no. So I look at some of Trump's nominations, Jack, and I see some good appointments or good nominations. And then I look at people like that, and you really do start to worry about what might happen.
Yeah, well, I look at it, and my attitude is much the same as every new president comes in. There's some nominations I like, and some of them I think are very odd indeed.
Yeah, well, this Sebastian Gorka is pretty much top of that heap, Jack. Policy.
I don't know that he's a Nazi, but he's a very odd choice.
Like I say, if he's not a Nazi, he talks the talk, Jack. Energy policy, Trump energy policy is starting to take shape. There'll be a green light for new and pending LNG export permits, which the Biden administration curtailed. New and pending drilling plans offshore and on federal lands. Approval of the Keystone pipeline, that's been going back and forth now for probably 12 years. Rollback tax credits for electric vehicles, funding to replenish the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which Biden ran down, and withhold funds for the International Energy Agency unless it becomes less obsessed with net zero. Some of this will take time and require congressional approval. Now, that's basic. That's a broad brush sort of exercise on what Trump's energy policy might look like. But what does it mean for Australia? I don't think it means much, does it? We don't have energy reliance on the Americans.
No. If they do shift, if the Americans shift away from net zero, and that's what Trump would like to do, some of this he needs to get through Congress, but quite a lot of it he doesn't need to at all. What do you think it would happen to Australia? Australia's, they're big on net zero, right?
Most of the world is, Jack.
Yes and no.
Well, give me a country that's not Brazil, like a major country in the world. We could talk about Armenia and Uzbekistan and all this sort of stuff.
Neither of the two biggest countries in the world are not, China and India.
Oh, no, they're working towards net zero, but because they are part of the developing world rather than the developed one, the rules are a little different in their case.
Yeah, no,
which
I don't.
which means, and I think it was Peter Gredlin or maybe Janet Albrechtson today was saying what we have to give the Chinese money for this, and which does sound a little bizarre, but. Let's have a look now at trade, Jack, and what we can expect from the Trump administration there. Trade war, 10% hike across the board. I'll get to the Rolling Stone article in a minute, but what does it all mean? It just means that basically Americans will be paying more for goods that they consume than they did a year ago.
That's exactly what happens with the tariff. Yes.
Do you think Donald Trump might not really understand how tariffs work, mate? Because he thinks it's actually a money spinner.
Yeah. Well, perhaps he does and perhaps he doesn't, is the answer to that. I watched an interview with the bloke who's been nominated, I think, for Treasury Secretary. He's the current head of Cantor Fitzgerald, the New York broking house. He's the chap who I think his son was starting kindergarten on 9/11, and he was going into work late so he could take his son for kindergarten for the first day. And his view, and there are some people around Trump who at least say this, that tariffs long term are a pretty bad idea, but they're a great negotiating tool.
What people may not understand too is that a number of the tariffs that Trump implemented in his first term were continued by the Biden administration and in some cases added to.
Yeah, the tariffs against China, for instance, were added to. Trump actually changed America's policy settings on China after 25 years of a different approach. But no one has changed those back. In fact, they've gone deeper down his change of direction since then.
Now, the justification for tariffs against China, a broad sweep across the board of 10%, with other things like electric vehicles to be basically just tariffed out of the market. The rationale for this is that fentanyl is coming from China.
Via Mexico.
Yeah, there's a lot of fentanyl being made in Mexico too. I'll get to that in a minute.
But the allegation is that even the fentanyl that's made in Mexico is made with precursor agents that are developed in China and sent across there.
Yes and no. Certainly the cartels started reading. Certainly Sinaloa started reading the data on this. They're like suited marketing men. They looked at at this sort of flood of opioids, particularly OxyContin across the United States. They could see a spike in demand for heroin that was considered very much a niche product from the cartel, and so a lot of poppy fields have been created in Mexico, and a lot of assembly of fentanyl, and also smuggling of precursors of fentanyl. Most of which, as I understand, as you say, Jack, come from Guangzhou. You would think the Chinese would be keen on that. And the other thing you've got to deal with here is that if you're a Chinese and you get caught in this, basically that's you done and dusted, isn't it? They will bring in the death penalty for this sort of stuff. But it hasn't stopped.
I think China executes more people per year than anywhere else in the world. Yeah.
Maybe not Texas, Jack. I'm only kidding. Well, you used to be able to count Texas just about being the worst, just about anything, particularly around detention, jails, and punishments.
So I just finished what I was saying. There are at least some people around Trump and who will be in the new administration who consider this more or less to be a bargaining chip, because the 25% tariffs are against Canadian goods as well. That's not just Mexicans.
Well, the Rolling Stone today, Jack, reckons, and look, it was a bit skinny on evidence, but they said that the Trump administration in waiting have discussed the prospect of an invasion, a military invasion of Mexico, Jack, to hunt down the cartels.
Oh, I thought you were going to say somewhere they're going to invade Canada.
Well, the Canadians would apologise, but Mexico, apparently, it's said to make the Mexican president a little uncomfortable here. But look, there was actually a decent quote, and I presume this came from X. This is from Cenk Uygur. You might pronounce that better and more appropriately than me. He's a Turkish-American political commentator, Jack.
The Young Turks. He founded. I think it's on YouTube, like a podcast thing called The Young Turks, and he's made quite a success of it.
Well, this is what he had to say, Jack. Okay, we have our first real fight of populist versus establishment. I'm officially supporting President Trump's pick of Representative Lori Chavez de Rema from Oregon for Labor Secretary. All Murdoch media outlets, Chamber of Commerce, never-Trumpers and establishment Republicans are against her. This is what realignment looks like. Trump made a populist pro-worker pick, and I'm here to support it. All the corporate Republicans hate it. Will establishment Republicans win, or a combined populist front? Well, that's a fairly uncontroversial sort of series of questions. But what I did like about one of his musings recently was that, yes, he said Trump is a populist, but he said, the Democrats think that voting for Trump is like joining a cult. But he made the rather obvious point that if Trump doesn't deliver as a populist, becomes an unpopular populist, then people will drop off him rather significantly.
Yeah, what interested me about what he had to say here, the reason why the establishment don't like, the Republican establishment don't like this Labor secretary is that she's a bit of a darling of the teacher unions, and they don't like the teacher unions. But he's raising an interesting point of the battle between the establishment, be it Democrat or Republicans, and the wider community. Peggy Noonan was interviewed yesterday. Peggy Noonan was the former Reagan speechwriter who's been, since then, the last 35 years, has been writing for the Wall Street Journal. Very good columns. Even when I don't agree with her, at least she can write. And she said that she thought the election was a major defeat for what she calls the protected establishment, and they were defeated by the unprotected, and I think there's a bit to be said for that.
Yeah, okay. I'm just closing my window so the bloke down the road with the mower doesn't interrupt our sound.
And the bit that I liked, she said, and bless them, the protected, they don't even realise this has happened to them. And I think there's a bit of truth in that as well.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, look, I did like this from Cenk. He said, and this is just a day ago, this is his latest X tweet. I'm going to make my boldest prediction yet, he says. I think at least half of Trump's base are actual populists, and they will challenge him if he goes awry. No one on the left will believe me. They think everyone in Margaret is in a cult and will follow Trump no matter what. I disagree. That's almost a statement of the obvious, isn't it? I would have thought.
Well, I think he's absolutely right about that.
Now, you get it wrong, you're going to get punished.
Yes, of course.
All right.
I mean, the usual rules of politics have not been suspended.
All right.
So
Jack,
if
in
you
the
get it
Middle
right,
East, we have a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, which will last for 2 months, provided everyone sticks to the terms of it. What's the likelihood of that happening, Jack?
pretty good.
I would think so. I did notice Hezbollah, I'm going to say 24 hours before the ceasefire was finally mandated. We were receiving lots of news that it was impending, that a ceasefire agreement was we're on the verge of an announcement and so forth, and Hezbollah did fire a number of rockets into northern Israel. And that might have been the last hurrah.
Yes, they've been significantly damaged. There's a lot of gossip that the ceasefire was forced on Israel by the US administration, but we'll have to wait and see whether that's true or not. But in any event, Israel will have achieved most of what it wanted to achieve against Hezbollah.
And meanwhile, Jack, there are 2 warrants, one for Benjamin Netanyahu and another for his former defence minister, I think. And I'm trying to think.
It is a former defence minister. Yeah, Gallant, I think.
Yeah, Gallant, yeah. And they've been issued with warrants essentially warrants for the arrest by the International Criminal Court. What does that mean for them, and how sustainable are these charges, Jack, or these warrants?
It doesn't mean much for Netanyahu and Gallant. They can travel to the United States, probably a large number of other countries they wouldn't be sure whether they could travel to. What it means for them...
There'd be a lot of Europe that they wouldn't be allowed into now, or would feel that they couldn't go unless they got their collars felt.
The UK government hasn't made its position clear, nor has the Australian government, for that matter, made its position clear.
The Australian government's response to this was, from Penny Wong, was just really just to talk about the legitimacy of the ICC rather than any sort of indication of support for or against.
Yeah. I actually think this is an act of self-harm by the ICC myself.
We shall see, Jack. The Houthis, where do they stand now?
Well, they've already announced that they are going to... That all along this was just defensive, was their attitude, that they were not seeking to attack people, and they're going to stop doing it. Whether that remains the case depends on a few things, but it would make a big difference to world trade if ships can now go back to going through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. It would make a huge difference to Egypt. Egypt's been suffering from the lack of trade and shipping through there, which gives them money. And
the Iranians, Jack, they're very diminished from this conflict, aren't they? They got found out.
Yes. Yeah.
And they got found out militarily. I mean, they were completely outgunned in terms of technology by Israel, and while they talked about terrible responses and all sorts of hyperbole about what they were going to do, nothing much happened.
And their Arab neighbours will have been taking notes of all of this.
I would have thought so too. I mean, the great sort of Middle East conflict that we've almost had by proxy now for the last, more than 20 years. Perhaps it goes back a bit further, but it's really sharpened over the last 20 years. Is the clash between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Saudi and the other Arab countries
and the Gulf nations, particularly, and that is a cultural and sectarian and religious conflict in the making, based on the separation of Islam between Sunni and Sharia.
Yeah, and
Shia, I should say.
It certainly means that the Iranian side of that conflict is vastly diminished. The Israelis have, as you say, demonstrated just how poor the Iranian military capacity is, and that's changed the nature of the conflict.
Over to Ukraine. I noticed there's a piece there from The Conversation talking about public disillusionment, 1,000 days of conflict. Now, what the thing we were talking about last week, Jack, is that Biden has now approved the use of long-range missiles being used being sent into Russian soil, and the Ukrainians took did not delay in firing a few over, and then Putin made the sort of started jangling a little bit like the Iranians, I would have thought. Started threatening a nuclear response. There was, I believe, a ballistic missile sent to Dnipro in the eastern Ukraine that was picked apart by the Ukrainians, and that was Russia's way of saying, look, that's got a conventional warhead on it, but it's easy to pop a nuclear warhead on it and fire it just in the same place.
Yeah.
Yes. Where does this all go, Jack? I mean, under Trump, where does this all go? One thing I took from this is when he had an early conversation with Putin, and not long after his election, Trump's election, he urged, I suppose is the right term, he urged Putin not to escalate. And I think that's a good sign that at least Putin will not go hell for leather. I mean, he must be struggling, mate, because why else would you pull North Koreans into the battlefield? But where does it all end, Jack? There has to be a negotiated settlement, but as I've always said, the negotiated settlement really has to start on the basis that the Russians need to pull back to pre-2022 borders.
Yeah, this is going to be a hard one to solve, but I think it's at the point where there is a bit of desire for a negotiated settlement, and that's what the article and the conversation was indicating, that there is some shift in the Ukrainian population's view of this. They probably still want all the things they wanted before, but they also recognise that they would like to see the conflict come to an end.
Yes. Well,
and that's
days.
No one's going to get what they want, is my suspicion.
We shall see. Canada, Jack.
How are our North Korean soldiers going? Have they been given a social media ban and some restricted access to the internet?
They pretty much need to, Jack. As they turn on the phones, and all of a sudden they've got a couple of missiles headed their way, targeting that phone. Canada does not feature in the 2024 year of elections. It will go to an election on or before October 2025. So they will have an election like Australia does. And the polling is just unbelievable, Jack. You've got the Conservative Party running at 48%. Trudeau's party's running at 17%. And then you've got a couple of minor parties. Well, they've won one minor party. The NDP is polling around about the same. And they're coalition partners, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. And they're the big party in British Columbia, in Vancouver.
Right. BQ and others make Greens about 6%. It looks like a flogging in the making, and I don't think that would shock too many people.
Yeah, no. The young Conservative leader is a good campaigner.
Yes.
And Trudeau has been there a long time.
It is one of those truisms, Jack. That even good governments, and I know you would argue that it is not a good government, but even good governments must come to an end.
Yes,
it's just the way it works.
That they do. You either go early if you want to go on your own terms. You go early. Otherwise, you're going to be carried out by the handles. So
quick look at those numbers again. Yeah. Well, look, if it stays that way, you've got basically a centre-left coalition getting about 34% of the vote, with the Conservatives 48%. So that looks like a landslide in the making.
Even on a seat-by-seat, they would win well over 200 seats, the Conservatives.
How many seats in the Canadian Parliament, mate? I did look this up once.
300 and something, but it
Yeah,
gives them a
small
clear
300s.
majority. Yeah.
All right, that is one for next year, Jack. And now we're on to sport because we had the first test in Perth, and normally it is just the touring side just gets absolutely belted, particularly if they come from the subcontinent, unused to the bounce, not ready for it, ball coming onto the bat, which are not the same circumstances on wickets in the subcontinent for the most part. And what normally happens is a thorough belting and a victory to Australia. This was entirely the opposite, Jack.
It was. It was one of those strange test matches. What did the Indians make? 150 odd in the first dig?
150, and we thought, gee whiz, their batting's terrible again.
Yeah, and you have to remind yourself, let's wait till the other mob have a bat. And I didn't see much of the first two innings. And Australia was skittled for 100, weren't they?
104, I think. And look,
then they couldn't get the Indians out at all. That was a real problem.
I think there were difficulties there, but let's go back to the 104. That's when it all fell apart. And let's start with Jasprit Bumrah's 4 for 18. He had 5. He ended up with 5, but on that first day's play, he had 4 for 18 from I think about 12 overs, 10 or 12 overs, and those figures don't sound stellar, but it's one of the best fast bowling spells I've seen. He was hitting the stumps virtually, I'm going to say, not every ball, but let's say out of 5 overs, he was hitting the stumps 28 times or hitting pads. He's just very, very good. And if you look at his average, his strike rate, it's right up there with the great bowlers in history. I see he was measured against S.F. Barnes, Jack. One of the great bowlers for England pre World War One, World War Two, and his average I think is about 17. It stands as the highest average for blokes who've taken I think over 150 Test wickets.
Yeah, Sid Barnes. Yeah.
Yes, well, that's not Sid Barnes, the Australian. That's S.F. Barnes, the UK.
England fella.
Yeah. Oh no, he's a rather extraordinary character. I think he played well into his 70s at a pretty good level, and was still knocking blokes over. But Barnes, he had put in a request for his wife to accompany him on a formal English tour of South Africa, and that was declined. And in typical fast bowl fashion, he got the hump, never played for England again, and continued to play in county cricket and then league cricket. There's a lovely little story told about someone emerging or going into a changing room, and S.F. Barnes, he is a Sydney, by the way, and S.F. Barnes was he had his own little corner of the changing room, and there were unguents and bandages and all sorts of things. But like I say, he was still knocking blokes over well into the 1950s. He died in 1967. But back to Jasprit Bumrah.
I saw a bit of Nasser Hussain and Mark Atherton talking about Jasprit Bumrah, and they had this to say, that not only is he the best cricketer in the world over all 3 formats, he's the best at each of the formats.
There's so much batters and bowlers stuff that very difficult to compare. He is the best fast bowler in the world. I think we can say that. You would put Cummins probably second, but it's pretty much a long way back second. They are similar bowlers in one respect. It's that they bowl at the stumps. But Bumrah's action, I was listening to an interview with Glenn Maxwell about what it's like to face Bumrah. And if you've seen his action just at release, his bowling arm is well back, so it's not the traditional sort of horizontal. He's letting the ball go back well behind his ear, and Maxwell said you can't it's almost impossible to pick up the difference between a short ball and a ball on a good length, or a ball and a drivable length. And and he said that's part of the problem. But he's always, you feel like the ball's going to come into you, but he's got the ability to swing it away as well. So he is a stunning player. And like a lot of the Indians, he sort of has an extraordinary come from nothing story. He was raised by his mother, a single mother, in very desperate circumstances. And he seems to be a good fellow. He's a very good captain. I mean, it's easy to say he's a good captain when they're winning so comprehensively, but he was aggressive with his captaincy too. So, yeah, he probably won't be captain now. We saw Rohit Sharma having a whack in the nets at Perth, and of course they've got Ajay Jadeja in the wings. They've got Ravi Ashwin. There are a couple of others there that I can't think of right now. Oh, I think the good quick from the UK from India might be joining them as well. So
yeah, this is pretty remote. They were very, very good for a side that's come off a 3-0 defeat by New Zealand in India.
Well, they just weren't having it, were they? They were bound to get themselves out of that funk, and Bumrah did that. The other thing about the bowling attack, Jack, the Indian bowling attack, is that the other guys, there was a guy on debut who'd only played, a handful of first-class games for Delhi. He came into the side. Siraj is a really good bowler too. So they've got bowlers to complement Bumrah, and they've got some very good slow bowlers in the gun there. Now they move off to Adelaide. But before we get there, Australia's batting. Who in that 11 comes away from that test saying, "Well, okay, I did okay."
Who did okay?
Travis Head got 89. The second did.
Yeah.
I think Mitch Marsh batted all right there. I think he might have got 30 or 40. I think the keepers in not Wayne Carey, Alex Carey's in good shape.
That's his brother Alex, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't think the bowlers got a whole lot wrong. And this is the other great story of India. Jaiswal, and we had the first sort of coverage of who he is. This is a kid who basically lived in the shadows of Mumbai Stadium, living in a tent between the years of about 12 and 15. He looks, he's just turned 22. He looks absolutely golden for all formats, particularly Test cricket. Has that ability to lift tempo and drop it back when needed. Rishabh Pant was stumped under fairly extraordinary circumstances in India's second innings. He's charged down the wicket, but he is all class. And I just think we're going to get. I think we're going to get a beating. I think we're going to get beaten pretty comprehensively in this series. I hope I'm wrong. Adelaide pink ball test is next. And that can come down to who wins the toss and who loses it, particularly with the ball moving around around dusk and a bit later. Geez, how would it be facing Jasprit Bumrah at 7 o'clock in Adelaide, mate? You wouldn't want to. Well, you won't be. You won't be around very long. That's the only thing. You just won't be at the crease for very long.
Do they have a little bit of chat to Marnus about his habit of reviewing hopeless decisions?
Oh, well, I think Steve Smith's got a bit of a history there too.
I saw the Marnus dismissal. I was there with a pretty much, I think, half a dozen.
Oh, mate, it was hitting middle.
Half a dozen English blokes, and as he sort of sprawled on the ground, Marnus Labuschagne, they just sort of said, "Oh, that's out." Every last one of them said, "That's out." And
there might have been some slim hope that it hit him outside the line, but on replay that wasn't the case. And the ball tracking was hitting middle. So a bit of a wasted appeal there.
Yeah, and these young guys were, they're all cricketers, and they were when he made the sign and said we're going to review it, they're just it's FFS was their response right around a lot of them.
Yeah, look, if you missed the first innings, Marnus made a 53 ball two, and it was like watching someone being tortured. It was just awful. And it's almost like he's forgotten how to bat. He's just not going. His head and feet are going nowhere near the ball. So he spends a lot of time leaving the balls, which is probably a good strategy against Bumrah. But he's not going back or forward. He's shuffling across the crease, and then he makes this sort of almost sticks his belly into the ball, and then comes back because his belly's going to hit the ball. And it's just this sort of shuffling movements across the crease, just in leaving the ball. After, I guess by about the 40th ball of that two, he was at least getting on the front foot, and I thought, well, he looks a little bit better. There was only one way to play Bumrah, and that was pretty much on the front foot. Not that you were going to do much better, but if you're playing back to this guy, he's going to hit pads, and you're going to be out. Or he's going to hit stumps. I think what they have to do, the Australian side, is burn the tape and go to Adelaide, clear the mines and all that sort of stuff. But it would be the last run for Marnus Labuschagne if he fails in Adelaide. I don't know that they would make any other significant changes before I think the Gabba is after that.
Yeah, it's Adelaide, Brisbane, then Melbourne.
Adelaide, Brisbane, Melbourne, and Sydney, and I don't think they need to. Greg Chappell wrote a really good piece in the Herald yesterday, saying, "Well, who would you pick? Basically, who can come in?" Now, the only thing that they can do is possibly fiddle with the order, bring in an opener. I noticed Matt Renshaw. On the day Australia collapsed, he said that he and other openers around Australia felt hurt by the selection of Nathan McSweeney. And I thought, mate, shut up and just make some runs.
Cameron Bancroft made 100 after a very poor start to the season as well.
Yeah, Renshaw's made 100. Bancroft's made 100. Bancroft's been skittled early, which is probably just getting a good ball and bad luck and all that sort of stuff. Probably the only one you could bring in there is Marcus Harris, just on form. He's actually made more runs than Renshaw and the others, Renshaw and Bancroft. And that would mean pushing McSweeney down to third and down to number three and putting Marnus out of the side. There's not a lot of there just aren't a lot of high scoring threes and fours around. As I said, I think last episode, Jack, Peter Handscomb might be one good cricketer. I don't. He certainly. I think he said he made more 50s than anyone around the world in first class cricket. Just in the last season and a half, or this season and the half of last. But they're not. The cupboard's pretty bare, mate. I think we've got plenty of bowling options, and certainly Stark and Hazelwood and others will need to be rested. Scott Boland should play at the MCG. In fact, there should be a law about it that he must be picked if he's fit. But the batting, I just don't see a lot going on there. And it puts a lot on Smith, but it puts a lot on Khawaja and McSweeney too, because this is the reason Australia have been getting skittled, because they're 1, 2, 3 for bugger all. Too often.
Just while we're speaking, Kane Williamson is on 92 in Christchurch. New Zealand 4 for 227 against England. He's not been getting amongst the runs as much as he used to.
He's had some injuries. He didn't play in India, of course. He's just quality, mate. He's just head over the ball. Yeah. Not shuffling across the crease or anything. He's just, so much of batting is head position rather than foot position. But they often go hand in glove, and And he is, like Joe Root, when the ball makes contact with the bat, his head's right over the top of it. He's all quality, mate. So I think Australia been exposed a bit, and it might be one of those cases when you think about the talent that is left for India in their squad and outside it. Maybe this is just the start of a long, long period of dominance from India in all formats. But Australia need to lift. There's no doubt about that. Rugby, Jack, disappointing, wasn't it? But they got beaten by a rather poorly performed Wales.
Scotland.
I mean, in recent times, Wales have been Scotland. Yes, sorry. Yes.
Yeah. I
they
think
beat
Scotland.
Wales,
I think
of course.
Scotland is still ranked above Australia in the world rankings, but the Wallabies were after the good performances at Twickenham and at the Carter Stadium, they were up at Murrayfield not so good. Back to the problems they had over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and Jack, just to quickly have a look at the Premier League, did you see the result over the weekend with Tottenham absolutely spanking Man City away? I mean, that is at Man City Stadium. 4-0 or 0-4.
Yeah, and Man City gave up a 3-0 lead in a European match during the week since then as well.
Wheels falling off, Jack, possibly.
They are. I noticed
as talented as they are, they probably can't sustain that level of achievement for very long. They tend to have a bit of a lull around just around Christmas time or just before Christmas. But
I did see some video of some very animated discussion between Haaland and I can't think who else. There seemed to be a little bit of dissension in the ranks.
Well, Mohamed Salah, who's the Liverpool striker, absolute gun from Egypt. He's not far away from Haaland. He's kicked 10 and Haaland 12 for the season thus far. Liverpool are ahead by a significant amount, 8 points in front of Man City now. Their season is going along very well. Tottenham have recovered after a pretty ordinary start. They're at sixth. Arsenal struggling a little bit there. They're always kind of knocking on the door. We've got a long way to go, but they're 9 points shy of Liverpool. Chelsea, having a good season for once, are in third at this stage anyway. And Brighton, Jack, going pretty well. They've had a couple of really good seasons for sides that just sort of just arrived in Premier League not too long ago.
They're going to go.
All right, and just finally, Jack, the Swans, Sydney Swans Footy Club, grand finalists this year, disappointing in the grand final. John Longmire has resigned as coach, and Dean Cox will. I don't know that they've formally announced him yet, have they?
Yes, they have.
They have. Okay, all right, thanks. Yeah, so Dean Cox, a former West Coast Eagle ruckman, will take over full-time coaching responsibilities at the Sydney Swans Footy Club. West Coast Eagles were very keen to get him to coach the Eagles last year, and Cox was having none of it because what Sydney do really well is they have a succession plan. A lot of Melbourne-based clubs, well, they might have plans, but they don't stick to them. I think about my mob too. Sometimes don't do it. Do you think it was maybe 1 year earlier than they planned the succession, Jack?
Longmire said he came back from his usual trip overseas and decided on the way back that it was time to move on. I think it's been really handled really well. I mean, obviously you're disappointed after a grand final loss like that, but you don't rush around panicking. You take your time and think it through, and everyone gets time to think it through, and they come to a decision. One thing that's noticeable was Longmire had this conversation with the president and the general and the CEO, Tom Harley, a week before the announcement, and there was not a whisper anywhere, no leaks at all. one of the former sports writers in Melbourne,
Maybe the chair knew, and that was about it.
The chair and the CEO obviously knew because they were at the lunch.
Well, they were there, yeah.
Yep, but
That might have been it.
Yeah, good clubs don't leak is the answer with that.
Yeah, look, I mean, John Longmire did have one more year left on his contract, and I think there was perhaps a season or two ago succession planning around 2025. But obviously, as you say, John Longmire's gone away, reflected, and probably thought he's taken this group as far as he can, and it's time for someone else to come along. Cox is known as a player's man, so he's often the conduit between John Longmire or has been, and he'll get around the players and has good relationships with them, often sort of friendly type relationships with them. That will have to probably change a bit.
Yeah, it's been a measure of a club that's been really well handled. Longmire, I saw Longmire's speech, and he pointed out that in the middle of the year they were playing as well as any club has played over the last 3 or 4 years, right? And that's probably right.
Yeah, Geelong. I'd put Geelong up above them, and I'd probably put Brisbane above them, and that's about it, really. Collingwood, not quite.
You don't get to be 2 or 3 games in front of everybody else by accident. You know, that means you're playing really, really well when you've got a lead like that at the halfway mark of a season. So there's a lot to like about where they are, but clearly they've got some problems to fix.
Yeah, but I think they've got a list that's young enough. They were not active in the trade period, not hugely active in the trade period. And Richmond, Jack, in the draft, well, they've basically got a new team, including the number 1 draft pick, who looks like he's ready to rock and roll. He's got the body of an adult male, yet only just 18 years of age. And the Blues picked up the Camporeale twins, Jack. Scott Camporeale's 2 boys. One an inside mid got picked earlier, and the other one likes to play out in the wing. So that's always nice. So Carlton haven't had father and sons for a long time.
Since Jack Silvani.
Keep an eye on Chris Judd. He's got a young fellow. He must be getting into his teenage years now, so we'll see how that all goes. Don't want to put any pressure on the kid. All right, well, that just about takes us out, Jack. Have you got anything weird and wonderful to tell us before we leave?
I think we can't let this pass. Can't let this go past. Have you seen the Kamala Harris interview, that the video that the Democrat Party campaign put out?
No, when was this? Give me some timing. Give me some idea of timing.
Yesterday.
Right, no.
No. It's about 16 minutes in total. And there's been a lot of criticism even from within the Democrat Party about this. People saying, this is what happens when your staff hate you. When they release a video like this. Various people have suggested she looks like she's been hopping into the Chardonnay really, really vigorously, and she does look like that, to be honest. It's an absolute shocker. The explanation that made me giggle a little bit was someone saying, well, they've seen the polling that puts her on top of the list for 2028, and they said, no, we can't have this. We'll release this video. But other stories are that she insisted that she thought it was really good, but it's a shocker.
All right. Well, yes, to the winner the spoils, and losers can pretty much please themselves, Jack.
Yeah, I watched it and felt a little bit sorry for her, really.
Yeah. Look, next week I'll be away. I'm heading to my homeland in New Zealand for a week's holiday. So
that's if you're not. And hopefully, if you're not arrested at the airport on arrival, we'll be able to resume in the week after that.
I don't think they'll be making too many customs arrests in Queenstown Airport, but there is a lovely cricket ground not far away.
It won't be a customs arrest. This will be, for having sledged New Zealanders for the last 50 years,
I've always been very, very kind to my people. So we'll be passing next week, and then we'll be back to you then. And one of the things I was going to do was get you to nominate 3 books that you'd recommend people have a read of, Jack, if you wish to. I will be doing the same. They don't have to be new books. They're just things that you've read and really enjoyed and think are read as well. One of those books is by Patrick. One of the books that, well, I'll recommend another 3, but one of the books that I would recommend is Patrick Redden-Keefe's Say Nothing, which is an extraordinary tour, and he's a wonderful writer. It's a true story about the Troubles. I won't say too much more about it other than it focuses on the disappearance of a mother of 10. She was abducted by the Provisional IRA in 1970. Her body found many, many years later. The crime remains unsolved. It's not part of the amnesty. But with that context, we explore the Troubles going all the way through pretty much to the present day. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And there is
a TV show.
There's a TV streaming thing. I think Disney Plus has it in Australia. Just called To Say Nothing Again. Anything, listeners, anything by Patrick Redden-Keefe, who's a journalist, come professional writer, based in Boston. Anything he writes is worth your time. But we'll come up with a bit of a list pre-Christmas for all sorts of other things as well. All right, that takes us out.
Mine will be all 3 Peter Fitzsimons books.
Well, have you got the new one yet? There must be something on the shelves yet. There's got to be something on there. It's how you know it's Christmas, Jack.
Yeah.
There's a Peter Fitzsimons book, 400 copies standing in a big pile in the bookshop. Yes, well, no, I can guarantee you none of mine will be from the bandanaed one or the unbandanaed one now. But we'll throw a few things around that you might like to have a read over Christmas, listeners. And we want to thank you again for joining us. We'll be back with you in a fortnight now, and we look forward to that. In the meantime, please feel free to drop us a line, just as. And I must make mention, just as Lawrence did, but I must make mention of our very good friend Ray. Ray has thrown a hell of a lot of stuff at us this week, but most of it, Ray, deals with a matter before the courts, and we can't really talk about it. So perhaps that's Ray. You should perhaps steer your gaze away from that particular matter and drop us a line about something else. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear from everybody. Please drop us a line. You get hold of me on X. My DMs are always open, Jack the Insider. And you get hold of Hong Kong Jack on his Substack.
Yeah, hongkongjack.substack.com.
There you go. Thanks, listeners. We'll be seeing you. You'll be hearing from us in a couple of weeks. Cheers. Bye.